My name is Sonia, which probably was the very first thing you could have saw on that card. But let me just open up my slide and that will take it from there. We'll just present it from here, just a minute. And I am hoping you guys are seeing the slide. So let's start with the Shinigami of the cyber world. Before we get into it, a little bit about me, it would be that my name is Sonia, which is quite obvious, and I have a bachelor's degree in computer sciences. Now, see, when I did my bachelor's, I wanted to be Mark Zuckerberg. I thought that guy has figured it all out. And then I realized that I actually care about data privacy of others, so that was a no-no. And then I wanted to sound a little bit, smart. So I dabbled a little bit in blockchain just to sound super amazing during social gatherings. And yeah, but then when I started doing it, I realized it was actually super fun. Uh, just a little bit about what I'm currently focusing on is cyber terrorism. I love that topic. I think it has a lot of things that we need to discuss and talk about and research. Other than that, I love doing advanced persistent threats, researching them, studying about them, hoping one day I would be smart enough to figure out the code. Yeah, that's a struggle. Hopefully, we'll get there. And security regulations. By profession, I am a cybersecurity analyst, and I love doing my job, my way of just going to the office and helping businesses out. That's something I love doing. And at night, I am Batman. I wanted to be one, but I couldn't. So I'm a student in cybersecurity, studying all that I just said before. That's pretty much my story. Let's move to the Shinigami in question. So Shinigami is basically from something that's from Japanese mythology, which means a spirit that calls you or invites you towards death. Now, the cyber Shinigami, which is Ryuk, is literally the cyber version of an actual Shinigami from a show called Death Note, but we don't have time for that. So let's just stick to Ryuk. Ryuk is a malware that is something which I find interesting about Ryuk is that not a lot of people talk about it, yet it's quite relevant in the media of cybersecurity. A lot of people were attacked by it. So how did it all begin and what it does is something that we will be discovering in today's slide and talk, basically. So it was August 2018. And in that, what happened was there was an attack on a organization, a US government organization. And the attack was done in a manner where the resemblance of the attack was of some malware called Hermes. Now, Hermes is a Trojan ransomware, and it was discovered in 2017. The attack and its resemblance towards Hermes was so similar that people thought that Ryuk wasn't even a malware, it was just a new variant of Hermes, which then we kind of discovered down the line wasn't the case. Now, just a little bit about Hermes is that it's a Trojan ransomware. It's most famously targeted banking infrastructures. And its way of deception was not only encryption, but it would always append the file encrypted with the .hermes extension. This is where you can actually identify the Hermes malware attacked your system. Now, Hermes is readily available on underground forums if you know where to look. And this is where, when the attacks from Ryuk started to increase, people realized that the actual malware that was lurking was Ryuk and not Hermes. Earlier versions, as I just said, were very similar to Hermes of Ryuk. And the actual unveiling of the Shinigami happened in 2018. To be exact, it was around February. Not sure the exact date, but the year was 2008. Okay, moving on a little bit more. So when we talk about who made some malware, especially in APT circle, it's very, very hard to pinpoint exactly who did what and where did it came from. However, allegedly, this malware, Ryuk, was developed by Wizard Spider, or they're also called Grim Spider and whatever. They have a lot of names, but they're quite famously known as Wizard Spider. And they're a Russian-based group. They have been involved in multiple attacks, and their most famous ransomware was TrickBot, which you will find a little bit more about while we're discussing Ryuk, because TrickBot and Ryuk have a very close relation with each other. Okay. So the pandemic begins, and the reason for that is I wanted to divide this talk in not only what Ryuk is, but how basically Ryuk gets into your system. It's very, very important to know exactly why something is happening instead of how it's happening to avoid the devastating mayhem it causes further down the line. Okay, so when we talk about Ryuk or any type of malware in general, there's always an initial starting point. And most of that initial starting point is either a phishing email or a computer on the network that has remote desktop protocol or any type of remote protocol open that the attacker can exploit and get access to that particular node on the network. In terms of Ryuk, the samples that were studied and the research that I did and literature that I found suggested that most cases for Ryuk were phishing emails. And in those phishing emails, they were either infected with a URL or a weaponized Word document. It is immensely, immensely interesting for me that even in the year 2021, phishing emails are still a thing and people are avid victims of phishing emails. And that kind of goes to show that the lack of cybersecurity awareness to a very ground bottom level really, really needs to be done correctly. Phishing emails for Ryuk, or the samples that were studied for Ryuk, consisted of, as I said, URLs that were infected. So basically, these were URLs that triggered the download of a dropper malware, which we will get into in a couple of minutes, or a weaponized Word document. Now, to people who might not know what a weaponized Word document is, a weaponized Word document is something that contains malicious macro code. There's these things in Microsoft Office, especially Microsoft Word, called macro code, which really helps you to format your document and makes you do a lot of other cool stuff. And once those codes have some type of malicious, code inside of them, and the document opens, it triggers a download for you. So in both of these cases, either the URL or the weaponized Word doc, what do they do is that they triggers a specific download for a dropper malware. Now, let's get into what that dropper malware is and what it does. Awesome. So when we talk about a dropper malware, it's very, very essential to explain what it is. A dropper malware is a malware that basically takes the actual attack malware, packages it, and then delivers it to your victim's machine. So think of it as a pizza man. A pizza man is carrying a pizza for you. No, it doesn't matter if the pizza is good or bad. It just carries it to you, and then you open the box and you figure out, hey, it has mushrooms and olives, and I didn't order that crap. I mean, seriously, if you're eating pizza with mushrooms and olives, you should be in jail. Okay, that's my verdict on it. But moving on a little. So that's what a dropper malware does. And in case of Ryuk, before I go further in this, I need to really emphasize that Ryuk is a very manual malware. It's not automated. It doesn't work as other malware. It's a very manual malware, and it needs you to first clean out the way so that it can actually do what it needs to do. And that's where a dropper malware comes in. So in the samples where you studied, a dropper malware were two. There were two very common dropper malwares. So it was either TrickBot and BlazeLoader. And in some cases for you, there wasn't any dropper malware, and I will tell you why. No, there was dropper malware, but there wasn't any other payload involved for that dropper malware. And we're going to get into it why what I mean by that. So let's get a little deeper on the dropper malware aspect for you. So a dropper malware comes in, it and it's triggered by either the URL or the weaponized word doc. That dropper malware gets into your system. Now, this is a very stealthy piece of code. It is designed to be hidden, and it is designed to have constant communication with a CNC or command and control server. Now, there were two samples studied for you. One of them had a dropper malware that was just doing what it needed to do and then get Ryuk downloaded into the victim's machine. The other samples of Ryuk, what they did was that the dropper malware was downloaded into the victim's machine. Then the CNC server was contacted, and that CNC server sent in another payload that did what the dropper malware was not able to do. Again, it really depends on what type of dropper malware you are using, what it can actually do, and what do you need it to do. Sometimes it's very important in any of these attacks. The time is of the essence, and the art of being hidden is excruciatingly important. Because if you're attacking and while you're attacking, you're exposed, that attack can be stopped. So we move to the next slide. So this is a little chart that has been developed, and it kind of shows you the life cycle of what is done in order to achieve that download from you. So you get a dropper malware, you drop it onto the victim's machine. The dropper malware then connects to a CNC server. One of the samples suggested that CNC server was a Cobalt Strike server. Then the Cobalt Strike server sends in a malicious payload, or very amazingly called a beacon. So it sends a beacon. A beacon is basically a payload, and a payload is any malicious code that is there to do something that needs to be done in order to get further access into that network. Then the beacon starts breaching the system. This is where the payload starts disabling your antivirus programs. It starts stealing your credentials. It starts moving your network laterally until it reaches the domain controller of that network. What is a domain controller? If somebody will have this question, well, a domain controller is, think of it as the big daddy of all daddies on the network. It controls everything that's going on to that network, from passwords to users to IP addresses. It has every single thing, and it can also decide the privilege each user needs to have in those networks. And then lastly, once that beacon or dropper malware reaches to that domain controller section, it then triggers the download of Ryuk from the command and control server. One thing that needs to be really emphasized in this entire cycle is whether you're using a dropper malware or the dropper malware is then asking the command and control server to send in a beacon. In either of these cases, the communication between the dropper malware and the command and control is going to exist. There's nothing in this of that sort that I just download something and suddenly once it's in my system, it stops communicating to its origin. If that communication stops, the further mayhem or the further domino effect will not persist for too long. And for a good attack, you need to make sure that the attacker, which basically is somebody controlling from the command and control point, has continuous information about the exploitation happening as it's happening. So we move a little bit more in this section of the pandemic. So we discussed the Kabul strike bacon at a length. Now I want to discuss something uh, that I found quite interesting while my research was that there were samples of Ryuk that didn't require a Kabul strike bacon or any further payloads. In fact, the dropper malware that were used in previous samples or even some later samples of Ryuk were TrickBot and Emote. The yes, load laser was also there. But I want to talk a little bit on TrickBot and Emote. And the reason for that is that the malware, they are standalone malwares themselves. So it's not like they're just some sort of bacon or some very specific payload. They're very specific, but they are standalone malware themselves. So the way they kind of interact with the exploitation phase is something I find super interesting. And the way that they do it is that uh, Emote and TrickBot have special features. If we talk a little bit about TrickBot have the speciality that it can very rapidly disable your endpoint security software. It has, it's actually known to do that. In fact, this was a malware that it was a Trojan malware that specifically did wire frauds for financial institutions around the world. And the very way that it did it was that it got into their system, disabled the endpoint security, and then did what it had to do. When we talk about emote is much more. I feel like it's much more clever than TrickBot because while it does what TrickBot does, it also have this thing where it can detect a sandboxing environment. And since all of these malwares are communicating directly with the command and control server, once emote is in your system and it detects it's in sandboxing environment, it lays dormant. It doesn't do anything, it doesn't communicate, it just lays dormant, which makes it highly invisible. And it gives the attacker enough time to get the hell out of there without having any active trace. And Emote can also actually detect virtual machine environments as well. So the Ryuk, when they were done through dropper malwares such as Emote or TrickBot, they have these very specific routes that they took, almost like the attackers kind of really knew what they were doing. And while researching a lot on Ryuk, I found out that a lot of time the insider threat was the major cause of a lot of malware. And I'm not pointing any fingers to on anybody because I don't know, but the research really suggests that a lot of time the malware exploitation cycle is really dependent on how much the attacker knows about the infrastructure. And most of the time, that knowledge of infrastructure is coming from the insider actor. Now, this could be a rogue employee, or it could simply be some attacker going into the premises and getting connected to that infrastructure and just, taking all that information and extracting it out. So in any cybersecurity attack, in fact, reconnaissance plays a very important role. And I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about reconnaissance, we consistently think of it as since it's a very non-technical phase of the cycle, it's not that important or it doesn't have any worth doing. But good OSINT or good reconnaissance can really help you make or break something. So this is a little bit on that. Moving on. Again, this slide is literally telling you what I just said a few slides ago. Emote is a very clever malware. And again, it gets into your system, it detects what it is, it moves laterally, it steals credentials, it gets to the domain controller, and then it triggers the download of Ryuk in that particular machine. So enough on Emote, let's move on. So this slide is my favorite slide because this is where we're going to get really deep into Ryuk, as deep as I can get in 15 minutes. I wanted to make sure this talk is technical as well as digestible for folks, so that not everybody feel left out. So let's start and analyze the mayhem. Okay, so one thing I want to really emphasize is that I've designed this in a manner where I'm explaining certain topics which may come across as very basic, but I think it is required. It requires an explanation because that will really help everybody understand every single thing that's going on. So now your dropper malware or your CS bacon is in the domain controller. It triggers a download for Ryuk and it downloads. What does it do next? Well, the one thing Ryuk does, it does anti-disassembly and anti-debugging. Why? What is anti-disassembly and anti-debugging? Well, anti-disassembly is when you have your source code and you have static and tools that analyze that source code. If you have the anti-disassembly, that prevents any kind of tool to analyze your source code. Why does Ryuk does it? Well, Ryuk is essentially a program. It has a source code and it doesn't want anything to analyze any of its weaknesses or flaws or its source code. So the very first thing it does is that it protects its binaries from being analyzed by any kind of tool. And the next thing that it does is it enables anti-debugging. And again, both of these are tools, both of these techniques are simultaneously used to reverse engineer some type of source code. Once both of these aspects are disabled or are some or are in a state where they cannot be utilized, Ryuk is somewhat at ease that okay, now I can do my damage in peace. Nobody's there nagging, and that's what is that is the reason why this is the very first thing Ryuk does. Okay, so the next thing what I really want to focus on was how does Ryuk does it? How does Ryuk do anti-disassembly and anti-debugging? Well, there's something called Windows API, and there might be a question that is Ryuk something that is only penetrated in Windows systems? No, there are Linux and other OSs. But the samples that I studied during my research were Windows machines. So that's why we're talking from a Windows perspective. So Windows API, what is it? And why is it important for this talk? Well, the reason Windows API is important is that anti-disassembly and anti-debugging, disabling these two things, is done through the manipulation of Windows API. And to understand how it's done, you need to understand what Windows API is. So Windows API is basically a interface that allows user-written programs to interact with the Windows OS kernel. So a little bit on OS 101, the kernel is the core component of any operating system. And everything around the kernel is what makes the whole operating system as what you can see on your machine. Everything interacts with the kernel, and then the kernel interacts back to it, and that's how the whole process of you using stuff works. The reason for a lot of Ryuk's operations are dependent on the manipulation of Windows API. And why is it manipulating Windows API is because Windows API is necessarily focusing on user-written program. This means endpoint security software is also there. Any type of backup software is also there. So that manipulation can really help Ryuk disable all of those softwares, do what it needs to do, and get the hell out. Well, it doesn't necessarily get out, it just encrypts everything. So it just stays there. But that is why we use Windows API. Okay, so I have 5 minutes left, so I really need to rush this. Okay, so Ryuk copy itself 3 times in the current directory it exists in. The first copy triggers a command line that is responsible for self-replication of the files that it's targeting. The second and the third top copy triggers the wake on LAN packet. Now, wake on LAN packet is actually a industry level protocol that sends a packet to every system on your network to basically power up in a very low power state. Before you, and this is done so that the malware can spread across the entire network. So before Ryuk starts an encryption, it stops certain processes and services. These service numbers and process numbers may increase and decrease. However, the actual known and counted are 41 processes and I think around 64 services. Either way, you guys can see it on the slides. So the reason for stopping these services is because most of these services or processes are either backup services, antiviruses, some type of service that a file is utilizing. So that's there. Again, a simple difference or basically differentiating between the two, what is a service and what is a process. A process is an instance of an executable file or any file that has a .exe. A service is something that is running on the background and it's communicating with your OS kernel so that your OS system can work properly. Okay, moving a little bit further. We have a little bit what Ryuk does once it starts encryption. So it encrypts both your network drive and your local drive. Every encrypted folder will have a ransom note at the end. And if there is an index file, which is also normally index.html, it will append the HTML ransom node because the ransom node is essentially an HTML file. So it will just append that code into this file. If it finds a PHP file, it does the same thing. It renders the PHP code, renders the HTML code into a PHP code. And the reason why it does that is that some researchers suggest that there were websites or public-facing HTML pages on certain machines. And so you want to also deface the website while it's encrypting you in the backend. Ryuk uses a encryption key which is generated from a window API called CryptGen key. That key is AES 256-bit, and that is a symmetric encryption key. And that encryption key is then encrypted further with an RSA key, which is a asymmetric encryption protocol. At this point, once all of these files are encrypted and then re-encrypted, the damage is done. There's nothing you can do about it. It's better to say RIP and pay the ransom. And that is pretty much how Ryuk kind of gets into your system, destroys it, and then laughs at your face. Some media appearances that Ryuk has made recently, and the victims are on your screen. There were other multiple victims which were either not known or were due to confidentiality reasons not reported. So these are the names of those victims. As you can see, most of them are government agencies. Moving down to the final slide. I don't like talking about a problem without providing some type of solution. So as an analyst and as somebody who's working in the industry, I think there are 3 most common ways which you can do to avoid any type of malware or any type of attack essentially. Number 1, patch management. Do it every single month if you have to. Technology is rapidly increasing its vector where the attack surface is just phenomenally big. So do that. Number 2, stop any unnecessary thing that you're not using. If those are ports, if those are services, if those are softwares, stop them, delete them, uninstall them, get rid of them. There's no point of having them in your PC if you're not using them. Last and certainly not the least, cybersecurity awareness and endpoint security. You cannot, I think the best investment any company can ever make is actually giving your users the education on how to handle technology and what to do and what not to do. And also buy an endpoint security product that is specifically there to solve your company's problems. Not don't follow a fad trend that this one is top and this one isn't. Use your brain. It's the best tool you can ever have. And this concludes my 50 minutes of Ryuk Shinigami talk. Where to find me? Well, I have a Discord which is up there. You can always email me, and there's my LinkedIn. So I honestly really hope you like this. I must have even forgot some things. Sorry for that. And yeah.
No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. Listen, we normally do a bit of a wrap up with some questions and stuff like that, but we are running a little bit over time. But what I'd recommend is please do reach out to Soniya. Grab her on the Discord. We do have some backstage rooms. I think Red Room is free just now. Do jump in Red Room, ask Sonia questions. And yeah, look, that was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for having me, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.